Okay, we are reading Captain Underpants and the Terrifying Return of Tippy Tinkletrousers. We are up to chapter 15. Alright, chapter 15 is up here somewhere. Where is it? After Dogman. Chapter 15, here we go. The plan. Mr. Krupp's day had been very busy, and he'd completely forgotten all about the two boys he had banished to the detention room. By the time the final bell rang at 2:45, George and Harold had finished their very first comic book. "Hey, this comic book turned out pretty good," said George. "Yep," said Harold, smiling. "I bet we could make copies of this and sell them for 25 cents each," said George. The two boys gathered their things and walked out the front door of the school. "We should start our own comic book company," said Harold. "Let's do it," said George. "We can call it Treehouse Comics, Inc." "Why Treehouse?" asked Harold. "'Cause my dad is building me a treehouse in our backyard," said George. "It's going to have electricity and a TV and everything. We can make our comic books up there." "Awesome," said Harold. George and Harold walked by the trash bin where Kipper and his friends were just about to administer killer wedgies to a couple of kindergartners. "Oh, Kippy," called George. The bullies turned and saw George reaching for his tie. Suddenly their eyes filled with horror. They released their prey and ran away, waving their arms and yipping like wiener dogs. "Yip, yip, yip, yip." "I think I'm going to wear a tie every day from now on," said George. "I think that's a good idea," said Harold. As George and Harold walked home, the two friends talked about their favourite movies and games, which videos were the funniest, and what kinds of bubblegum blew the best bubbles. Said Harold. "All that talk about bubblegum is making me hungry." "Come on over to my house," said George. "I make a mean peanut butter and gummy worm sandwich." "Really?" said Harold. "Yep," George said. "The secret is the chocolate syrup." "Okay," said Harold. Soon the boys reached George's house and headed for the backyard. George's dad was hard at work building George's new tree house. "Hi, Pop," said George. "Hi, buddy," said George's dad. "How was your first day at your new school?" "Okay," said George. "And who's your new friend?" George's dad asked. "This is Harold," said George. "He's a good drawer." "Hello, Harold," said George's dad. "Hi," said Harold. We've got a lot of work to do, Pop," said George. "Do you want us to bring you a peanut butter and gummy worm sandwich?" No thank you," said George's dad. The two new friends walked into George's house, made some sandwiches and got right to work. George and Harold knew it was up to them to put a stop to Kipper Krupp's reign of terror, so they made a long list of Kipper's strengths and weaknesses to get a better understanding of their mortal enemy. After a few minutes, Harold began to feel discouraged. "This is terrible," said Harold. "Kipper Krupp has so many strengths and I can only think of one weakness." "What's that?" asked George. "Well, he's kind of dumb," said Harold. George smiled and wrote down "kind of dumb" under weaknesses. "That's all we need," said George. Chapter 16, Super Spies. The next day at school, Harold stuck close to George. The two boys spent their every free moment spying on Kipper and gathering as much information as they could about their enemy. They wrote down Kipper's locker number and the type of padlock he used. They took note of Kipper's schedule and paid special attention to what he normally did between classes. They took measurements and even stayed after school to spy on Kipper's wrestling practices. By the end of the week, George and Harold knew Kipper's schedule better than Kipper knew it. Kipper Krupp was a creature of habit. Every day he did the exact same thing at the exact same times. At the end of every school day, Kipper would go to his locker and unlock his heavy-duty padlock with a key he kept on a thick metal chain around his neck. Kipper would place his padlock on top of his locker, then open the locker door. Next, Kipper would empty his pockets, putting his valuables inside the locker. His phone always went on the top shelf, and the money he'd stolen from the kindergartners would always get crammed into a duffel bag at the bottom of the locker. Finally, Kipper would grab his padlock from the top of the locker and put it back on the door and click click it shut to lock it. After wrestling practice, Kipper would go back to his locker and unlock it in the very same way. He'd retrieve his phone, grab his heavy-duty padlock from the top of his locker and put it back on the door. Finally, he'd click it shut to lock everything back up again. Surprisingly, Kipper usually left all his stolen money in his locker every night. Perhaps Kipper thought the money was safest in his locker. Nobody could open that locker without a key. Nobody but Kipper had the key, and Kipper never took the key off his neck, not even in the shower. "We'll never get that key away from Kipper," said Harold as the two boys walked up the aisles of the local hardware store. "We don't need the key," said George. "We just need this." George picked up a brand new padlock from the home security section. "This is the exact same kind of padlock that Kipper uses on his locker," said George. "But it won't have the same key," said Harold. "Each one has a different key." "I know," said George. "So how is that padlock going to help us?" said Harold. "You'll see," said George, smiling. After the boys paid for their brand new heavy-duty padlock, they went to the toy shop across the street. Down at the end of aisle 3, near the beads and jewellery, George found what he was looking for, a Susie Sunshine Friendship Bracelet Kit. "What is that for?" asked Harold. "We've got to make a couple of friendship bracelets this weekend," said George. "Why? What for?" said Harold. "You'll see," said George, smiling even more. What is he up to? That weekend, George and Harold spent a lot of time drawing up plans and designing pranks that would put an end to the bully situation at Jerome Horowitz Elementary School. Then the two boys went through their homes collecting everything they needed for the job. George found a long roll of shelf-lining paper in his kitchen and measured it carefully. "Hey, Mum, can we have this?" said George. "It's for school." "I suppose so," said George's mum. Harold found some old pants and dress shoes that his dad had left behind when he moved away. He was pretty sure his dad wouldn't mind if they nailed them to George's wooden stilts. "I still don't understand how we're going to hide these stilts in the school," said George as he practiced walking on them. "You'll see," said Harold, who knew a few tricks of his own. Chapter 17. Is that what we're up to? Yeah, Chapter 17, Monday. On Monday morning, the boys woke up early, gathered their supplies and headed to school, about 15 minutes before the rest of the students started to arrive. George and Harold carried their stilts and supplies into the boys' rest room upstairs and placed them inside one of the empty stalls. Finally, they closed the stall door and locked it. If you were standing outside the stall, looking underneath the door, it appeared as if someone was sitting down in there taking care of business. George and Harold knew that nobody would dare go near this stall, so it was now the safest place in the school to hide stuff. Tricky. Soon the students began arriving and the day started pretty much like normal. Mr. Krupp marched up and down the hallways screaming and making children cry. Kipper and his creeps stole money and distributed wedgies to the kindergartners, and a general feeling of hopelessness and despair filled the morning air. At lunchtime, as usual, the downtrodden kindergartners sat at their table with no food at all. Mr. Krupp stomped up to the kindergarten table and started getting angry. "How come you kids never have any food at lunchtime?" he shouted. Said one kid. "We're on diets." "Oh," said Mr. Krupp, as he pulled his belt up over his giant stomach. "Well, good," he said. "It's important to stay fit and healthy like me." In the afternoon, George and Harold asked to be excused so they could go use the restroom. They only had about 5 minutes to set things up, so they had to hurry. Harold opened the locked door of their secret restroom stall, and George climbed up on the stilts. Quickly, they sneaked out into the hallway. George stilt walked over to Kipper's locker, and Harold handed him the long spool of shelf-lining paper. Carefully, George placed the paper on top of the lockers and rolled it down to the end. The paper flipped over the edge of the locker tops and rolled down the side. Harold caught it and taped it to the side of the lockers, marking off some measurements with a ruler. George put the padlock that he and Harold had bought on the end of the paper 2 lockers down from Kipper's. They were ready. Quickly, they put their supplies back into the restroom stall, locked the door, and hurried back to their classroom. At the end of the day, Kipper walked to his locker as usual. He unlocked his lock with the key hanging around his neck, then put his padlock on top of his locker, right on top of the long roll of paper. George and Harold were standing about 6 lockers away, where Harold had taped the end of the paper to the side of a long row of lockers. Now came the tricky part. As Harold provided cover, George carefully pulled the long roll of paper. The paper began to move. Kipper's padlock, which was just above Kipper's head, began to move away from Kipper. George and Harold's padlock, which was 2 lockers away, began moving toward Kipper. Harold had measured everything carefully, so George knew to pull the paper exactly 24 inches. When he was finished pulling, the new padlock was directly above Kipper's locker. Kipper had just finished stuffing all of his stolen money into his duffel bag. He put his phone on the top shelf of his locker, closed the door, then reached up and grabbed George and Harold's padlock. Next, he closed the door and clicked the new padlock securely. "Let's boogie," said Kipper to his buddies as they strutted to the gymnasium to get ready for wrestling practice. "That was awesome," said Harold. "Yeah," said George, "but we've still got a lot of work to do." George and Harold waited patiently until almost everybody had gone home. Some kids were still in the gym or outside or in the chess club downstairs, but the hallways and restrooms were empty. George and Harold sneaked over to Kipper's locker, unlocked their padlock and opened the door. Harold unzipped Kipper's duffel bag and emptied all of the stolen money onto the floor. "Whoa," said Harold. "There must be $1,000 in here." Harold quickly scooped up the stolen cash while George typed on Kipper's phone. "What are you doing with that phone?" asked Harold. "I'm sending a text to Kipper's 3 goons," said George. Once the money was safe and the text was sent, George and Harold put everything back the way it was, with 2 additions. Harold put the Susie Sunshine Friendship Bracelets kit into Kipper's locker, and George placed an envelope beside Kipper's phone. Finally, George grabbed Kipper's padlock from the top of the lockers, closed the door, and locked it with Kipper's own padlock. Then they set everything up so it would be ready for tomorrow afternoon. "Let's get out of here," Harold said nervously. "Just one more thing," said George. Quickly, the boys sneaked into the gym locker room and left a second envelope inside one of Kipper's smelly shoes. Then they hurried out of the school and headed for home. "I kind of wish we could stay and watch the fireworks," said Harold. "I think it's better if we're not there," said George. "Things are about to get ugly." Chapter 18. Things Get Ugly. Kipper found the envelope in his shoe just as after wrestling practice ended. He opened it. Inside were 2 friendship bracelets and a note addressed to him. Kipper proudly slipped each friendship bracelet onto his wrist and admired them. He couldn't wait to show his buddies. "Dear Kipper, we made these friendship bracelets for you because we think you are totally cool and stuff. Love, the cheerleaders." And who were all out in the hallways. What's going on? Couldn't wait to show to his buddies, who were all out in the hallways staring at their phones in shock. "Look what I got," Kipper said proudly, waving his wrists at his goons. Kipper's friends, who were all reading the same text on their phones, looked up at Kipper with their mouths hanging open in disbelief. "What?" said Kipper. "They're just friendship bracelets." What's the message say? It said, "Let's make friendship bracelets. Get your supplies at my locker. Whoever makes the prettiest one gets a big kiss from me." That's what he sent to his friends. Kipper's 3 friends looked at each other like Kipper had gone completely mad. "I don't want to make friendship bracelets with you, dude," said Loogie. "Me neither," said the other 2 bullies simultaneously. "What are you talking about?" said Kipper. He unlocked his locker and opened it up. Oh no. "Hey, what the heck is this?" Kipper screamed. "Somebody's been in my locker." Loogie, Bug and Finkstein saw the Susie Sunshine Friendship Bracelet kit and shook their heads in disgust. Kipper kicked the kit into the hallway and stomped on it. Then he tore open his duffel bag. It was empty. "Ah!" Kipper screamed. "Somebody stole all my money." Kipper looked up and down the hall frantically. "When I find out who's been in my locker, I'm gonna kiss them," said Finkstein. The other two bullies laughed. Kipper grabbed Finkstein by his shirt collar and shook him back and forth like a rag doll. "What are you talking about?" he screamed. "This," said Finkstein. He showed Kipper the text that had been sent from Kipper's phone. "Oh, I didn't write that," Kipper screamed. "Well, what's up with those friendship bracelets on your wrist then?" asked Bug. The cheerleaders gave me those," said Kipper. At that very moment, a group of cheerleaders was coming in from practice outside. "I'll prove it," said Kipper. He showed the bracelet to the cheerleaders, waving his wrist at them like a lunatic. "You guys made these for me, right?" Kipper asked them, pointing desperately at the friendship bracelets. The cheerleaders gave Kipper a strange look. "Ew," said Wendy Swan, the head cheerleader. Kipper blinked his eyes like a crazy person. He began breathing heavily. He clenched his fists and shook with rage. Kipper's friends glanced at each other, exchanging silent, worried looks. They each took a few steps backward, as if they feared Kipper might explode. "Hey, we'll see you later, Susie Sunshine," said Loogie. The three bullies walked away laughing, leaving Kipper alone and frenzied. Finally, Kipper returned to his locker. He grabbed his phone and found an envelope beside it. Kipper tore the envelope open with insane rage and read the note inside. "I'm coming for you," signed Wedgie McGee. Oh no, who is Wedgie McGee?